Have you ever faced a choice so impossible that any decision seemed to rip a piece of your soul out? My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and today I'm opening my heart to share the most difficult story of my life. A story of faith, love, betrayal, and silence, all happening in the place I least expected, the church. Since I was a girl, I was taught that marriage is sacred, that the covenant before God is forever. And for many years I believed this with all my heart. But what do you do when the love that seemed eternal turns into abandonment? What is left for a Christian woman when trust is broken so profoundly? While I smiled to the world, inside I was crumbling into silence. The judgment was constant, even when no one said anything. All it took was a sidelong glance, a whisper in the church aisle, and my heart would fill with guilt. I wondered, have I failed as a wife? Have I failed as a Christian? Do you recognize yourself in this experience? The feeling of carrying a weight no one sees, of screaming inside, yet remaining silent so as not to disappoint others. There were nights when my prayers were nothing but tears. I asked for answers, for a sign, for a miracle, but it seemed God was silent, and this silence consumed me even more. Between the faith that told me to stay and the heart that begged me to leave, I found myself trapped in a seemingly inescapable dilemma. The following fact may change your perspective on what it means to truly believe in God. I know this story may seem harsh, but trust me, the ending is worth it. Every detail I'm about to share has the power to open your eyes to realities we often prefer not to see. Because sometimes, within faith, there are also deep wounds that no one dares expose. And it was precisely in this place of pain and silence that my life took a turn I could never have imagined. For many years, I lived a secret that seemed impossible to share, until today. I remember exactly what it was like to smile on Sunday mornings, sit in the front pews of church, and sing praises as if nothing were happening, while inside my heart was shattered. It was like living in two worlds at once, the world everyone saw, full of faith and hope, and the hidden, silent world, laden with pain and doubt. This division consumed me, and I didn't know how long I could maintain this mask. The weight of the perfect appearance was suffocating, and I felt that with each passing day, my soul was moving further away from the true peace I so desperately sought. I was afraid of the truth, afraid of the impact it would bring, afraid of judgment, afraid of no longer being accepted. And perhaps this is the point so many women know, but few have the courage to admit. That moment when faith, instead of being a refuge, feels like a prison. I loved God, but I didn't know how to reconcile that love with the betrayal that was tearing me apart. It was as if I were faced with an impossible decision: continue believing that the miracle would come or accept that my marriage wasn't what I thought. Behind the scenes of my life, there were nights of stifled crying, desperate prayers, and a silence that echoed louder than any words. There was also a constant fear, that of being blamed, as if the pain I carried was the result of my own failings. It's at this point that my mindset begins to shift. You begin to question everything: who you are, what you truly believe, where the line is between fidelity and self-destruction. It's like a forced journey into yourself, where each memory brings revelations that hurt but also transform. And in the midst of this process, I realized it wasn't just about marriage or betrayal. It was about identity, about the choices that define who we become, about the courage to see a hidden truth that insists on surfacing. Because deep down, the great battle wasn't against abandonment or judgmental stares. The great battle was within me, against the fear of admitting I needed to start over. But there is something even more essential here, something that few realize. I grew up in a home where faith was the foundation of everything. From an early age, I remember the smell of the wooden church pews, the sound of voices mingling in the hymns, and the feeling that it was the safest place in the world. My mother taught me that love was patient, kind, and endured all things. My father reinforced that marriage was a promise before God, an unbreakable covenant that reflected Christ's union with the church. These truths became the foundation of my mindset, and for years I never questioned them. At school, while other girls dreamed of travel and careers, I dreamed of a stable home, children running around the yard, and a husband who would look at me with the same affection my father looked at my mother. It was almost as if the journey had already been mapped out for me: education, marriage at an early age, raising a family, and faithfully serving in the church. This vision seemed so pure, so certain, that I could never have imagined the painful aftershocks that would one day unfold. With each service, with each verse memorized in Sunday school, the idea of eternal love solidified within me. I believed that if I faithfully followed the teachings, if I dedicatedly guarded my life, the impact would be a protected future, full of blessings. What I didn't understand at the time was that real life doesn't follow perfect scripts, and that even within faith, there are hidden truths, stories no one dares tell aloud. I remember nights when I lay in bed as a child and prayed, asking God to prepare my future husband. I believed that with His blessing, there would be no room for mistakes, errors, or pain. This was the mindset that accompanied me throughout my youth: complete trust, complete surrender, absolute certainty that all I had to do was believe. And this faith guided me until the day I met the man who would completely change the course of my life. In my eyes, he was the answer to all those childhood prayers, and it was at that moment that the dream began to take shape, bringing with it promises that seemed eternal, but which held revelations I wasn't yet ready to face. In my eyes, he was the answer to all those childhood prayers, and it was at that moment that the dream began to take shape, bringing with it promises that seemed eternal, but which held revelations I wasn't yet ready to face. Perhaps you felt this too, the feeling of living exactly what you've always asked God for, as if everything finally made sense. It's at this point that hope mixes with the fear of loss, and every detail seems to take on even greater meaning. And if, while listening to this story, any part of it has touched your heart, I want to ask you something simple but very important. Like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's your participation that keeps this message alive, that makes this channel reach other women who also need to hear stories like this, to not feel alone. When you interact, the impact isn't just here with me. It multiplies and creates a network of support, encouragement, and transformation. Your presence here is what gives me the strength to continue bringing these hidden truths to light and sharing each stage of this journey with sincerity. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. Every word you say is a reminder that we're all on this journey, together, learning, crying, and rising side by side. And as I continue to tell you, I want you to feel part of this safe space, because that's exactly what motivates me to share my story without masks. I believed with all my heart that encounter was a divine gift. But over time, I began to realize that reality was hiding signs I wasn't ready to see. I was only in my early 20s when I met him, and the way our paths crossed felt like something out of a carefully crafted story. He appeared in one of those chance encounters within the church itself, among mutual friends, and from the first moment, the way he looked at me made my heart believe something special was about to happen. It was as if all the prayers of my childhood had finally been answered, as if God had placed before me the man who would carry my dreams alongside his. His smile was captivating, his speech engaging, and I felt chosen, set apart to experience that love. Our relationship began with long conversations, loving messages, and a bond that grew with each passing day. I believed we were building something solid, a blessed future. He spoke of commitment, family, and honoring God above all else, and I saw in these words a perfect reflection of what I'd always envisioned for my life. With each service we attended together, with each hand we held during prayer, I became even more convinced that I was living a divine gift. This was the narrative I chose to believe, and it was what cradled my deepest dreams. When the wedding day arrived, it seemed as if all heaven was smiling down on us. The church was adorned with white flowers, every detail prepared as if it were the materialization of years of waiting and hope. Walking down the aisle was like crossing a bridge between the girl who prayed for her future husband and the woman who finally believed her promise was fulfilled. The pastor's words echoed like an eternal pact, and as we exchanged vows, I felt I was entering a destiny that could not be broken. There, before God and all who loved us, I believed that nothing could ever shake that bond. The impact of that moment was so powerful that it marked me in a way I could never have imagined. I saw in every detail a confirmation, a sign that I was on the right path. However, real life, with its invisible behind-the-scenes and hidden truths, had other revelations in store. And although I lay down that night with my heart full of gratitude and my mind filled with plans for a perfect future, time would show that even the most sacred vows can hide cracks that no one can foresee. The first years of our marriage were as I'd always dreamed, simple dinners that felt like banquets, shared laughter that echoed through the house, and plans that filled our hearts with hope. I believed I was living the perfect script, but over time, small details began to emerge that, though subtle, brought a quiet discomfort. There were delays he'd excuse with long meetings, sudden mood swings I'd attribute to fatigue, or the coldness in some gestures that were once full of affection. Deep down, something told me there was a hidden truth behind those attitudes, but my mindset was that of someone who believes love endures all, covers all, transforms all. I remember nights when he would come home later than usual, and even though it felt strange, I chose not to question it. I told myself I didn't want to seem suspicious. After all, a marriage based on faith shouldn't be shaken by doubts. I preferred to believe the version he gave me, even though there was an insistent whisper inside me pointing me in another direction. This decision to silence my own perceptions was, without me realizing it, the beginning of a journey of self-denial. I convinced myself that it was temporary, that things would return to normal, and that perhaps it was just the result of the pressure of work. As the months passed, the averted glances during conversations began, the cell phone always face, down on the table, and an emotional distance that I felt growing with each passing day. I saw the signs, but I transformed each one into acceptable excuses to avoid facing the pain of a possible betrayal. The truth is, I was afraid of the impact this revelation would have, afraid to admit that my childhood dream could be crumbling before my eyes. It was as if I preferred to carry the weight of an illusion rather than deal with the harsh reality. This choice to ignore the obvious imprisoned me. Even further, because every sign I missed created an extra layer of silence within me. I remembered the vows at the altar, the promise to remain steadfast, and I clung to that as if it were enough to sustain everything. But deep down, I already knew something wasn't right, and as much as I tried to keep up appearances, there was a part of me that was beginning to understand that this silence wouldn't last forever. I'll never forget the day my life suddenly changed. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where I was organizing the house and taking care of daily chores, when his phone vibrated on the table. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but something about that moment caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he'd left the phone face down. Maybe it was just feminine intuition, that silent whisper that so often tries to warn us before the truth comes out. Heart racing, I decided to look. It was there, in front of a brightly lit screen, that I found messages that shouldn't have been there. Words too sweet to be exchanged with someone other than me. Shared laughter, hidden secrets, promises of dates that didn't include me. At that moment, the ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. It was as if the entire narrative I had constructed up until that point had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shock was so great that for a few seconds I thought I was dreaming. My mind screamed that this couldn't be true, while my heart begged for an explanation that would never come. I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, a conversation taken out of context, any justification that could restore the peace I had just lost. But deep down I knew. This was the revelation I had feared, the confirmation that the signs I had ignored were pointing to betrayal. The feeling of denial was immediate. I closed my phone and took a deep breath, as if I could erase what I had just seen from my memory. I walked around the house in silence, trying to convince myself that maybe it wasn't so serious, that I could forgive without even confronting. But the pain was there, throbbing with every heartbeat, and there was no turning back. It was the beginning of a journey I never wanted to experience, but one that forced me to confront a hidden truth that could no longer be ignored. The impact of that discovery paralyzed me. I felt like the world I had so carefully built was crumbling before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. With each Memory of the altar, of the promises before God, my chest tightened even more. How could I reconcile the image of the man I swore to love forever with the messages I had just read? That was the question echoing in my mind, and it would lead me to decisions that would completely change the course of my life. It's funny how we can carry such a heavy burden and at the same time smile as if nothing were happening. After that discovery, my first reaction wasn't confrontation. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't exposing. It was silence. A silence that hurt, that suffocated me, but which I believed was necessary to protect the image of the perfect marriage everyone expected of us. Inside the church, we were seen as the exemplary couple, committed, present at every activity, always willing to help. How could I let that facade be shattered by such a painful truth? I kept the storm inside, while on the outside, I wore a calm. At church services, I would intertwine my hand with his and smile as if we were in perfect harmony. With my family, I made a point of keeping the narrative intact, responding with short sentences whenever anyone asked how we were. Inside, every word hurt, because I knew there was a chasm between what we showed and what we truly experienced. And yet, I chose silence. This silence wasn't just external, it was also of the soul. I silenced my own feelings, stifled my questions, and convinced myself that enduring was a form of fidelity, the mentality I'd carried since childhood dictated that a Christian wife must fight for her home, even when she seemed powerless. And I believed this almost blindly. It was as if I were on a journey where the ultimate goal was to preserve an image, even if it cost me my inner peace. Behind the scenes, the impact was devastating. I found myself praying fervently, but not for true transformation, but rather for no one to notice what was happening. It was a desperate plea for God to keep up that facade that I already knew was crumbling. This decision to remain silent brought with it harsh revelations. I realized that, often, within faith, appearances weigh more heavily than truth, and carrying this weight gradually distanced me from the essence of who I was. I chose silence, believing it would protect me, but over time, I realized it was actually eating me up inside, and it was at that point that I began to understand that the price of keeping up appearances could be much higher than I imagined. The silence I chose to protect the image of my marriage didn't shield me from judgment. On the contrary, it seemed to expose me even more. Inside the church, every glance lingered a little longer on me, as if there was a hidden truth everyone sensed, but no one dared to speak aloud. The whispers in the aisles were like invisible arrows piercing my chest, and their impact hurt more than any direct words. I could feel the conversations interrupted as I approached, the rehearsed smiles that hid questions, and it was as if every gesture carried a silent accusation. Little by little, I became an expert at reading expressions: a raised eyebrow, a glance up and down, a handshake that was too cold. Everything seemed to confirm that people knew, or at least suspected, something wasn't right. This feeling paralyzed me, because the mentality I grew up hearing always dictated that a Christian woman should protect her home at all costs. I felt that if the truth came out, I would be the first to be blamed for not being wise enough, submissive enough, strong enough. It was a veiled judgment, never explicit, but so present it was suffocating. Every Sunday, I dressed not only in beautiful clothes, but also in emotional armor to sustain the backstage of that collective performance. And even though no one pointed it out to me directly, the fear of what they might think was constant. It was as if I were forever indebted to an invisible audience, as if my life were a play that needed to keep running or it would fall apart. This climate of suspicion made me doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Were those looks real or a product of my own insecurity? These questions repeated themselves in my mind, trapping me in a cycle of guilt and silence. Deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The atmosphere was permeated with silent judgments that shaped my every move, and it was impossible to ignore. It was in this pressured environment, amidst whispers and smiles that didn't reach my eyes, that I began to realize how much of myself I was losing. My identity was no longer built on genuine faith, but on the fear of disappointing others. And this revelation showed me that, sooner or later, I would have to decide whether to continue living under the heavy gaze or whether to have the courage to face the consequences of the truth. The silent judgment surrounding me only increased the confusion within me. Outwardly, I stood firm, but inside, I was waging a seemingly endless battle. It was as if two opposing voices were vying for control of my mind and heart. On one side was the faith I'd always carried, reminding me of the vows I'd made before God, the promise that true love endures all, that forgiveness is the greatest expression of grace. On the other side was the stark reality with the messages I'd read, the distance I felt, the pain of knowing the trust had been broken. Between forgiving and staying, or breaking up and letting things go, I felt lost, as if any choice would shatter me. I prayed for direction, hoping for a clear answer, but the feeling was one of absolute silence. This silence, which already accompanied me in my interactions with others, now also seemed to come from God. I wondered if the lack of response was actually a test to test my fidelity, or if it was an invitation to see life from a different perspective. This conflict consumed me because I believed that choosing to stay would be an act of obedience, but choosing to leave could be a decision of self-preservation. And in both paths, I knew there would be painful consequences. The impact of this internal struggle was devastating. My emotional health began to show signs of wear and tear. I lived as if I were carrying a constant weight on my shoulders, and every daily decision, getting out of bed, cooking dinner, smiling in public, became a gargantuan effort. There were days when I convinced myself that transformation would come if I just held on a little longer, and there were days when the hidden truth appeared before me with such clarity that it seemed impossible to continue pretending. In the back of my mind, I played out scenarios. I imagined what would happen if I broke up, my family's disappointment, the whispers at church, the fear of being labeled as someone who gave up too soon. Then I imagined what would happen if I stayed, lonely nights with someone absent, the emptiness growing inside me, the slow erosion of my identity. Neither path seemed to offer peace, but I knew I couldn't live indefinitely at this crossroads. It was a lonely journey, where every thought was a battle, and every prayer seemed unanswered. The dilemma of whether to stay and fight for an already damaged marriage, or to seek something that would preserve my dignity became increasingly unbearable. And it was in this process of anguish that a new revelation began to form within me, something I didn't want to admit, but which insisted on making itself known. It was as if my every step was accompanied by a nagging doubt. Staying meant being faithful, but it also meant giving up on myself. Breaking up meant reclaiming my voice, but also carrying the weight of being seen as the one who broke the promise. This internal struggle consumed me, and often left me feeling alone in a desert without answers. And perhaps that's why telling this story here is so valuable, because, like me, there are many women struggling to balance faith and wounds, the desire for transformation and the fear of consequences. If you identify in any way with this journey and want to continue following every detail of this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a click of a button. It's the most beautiful way for us to keep this space alive, reaching other women who need this frank and truthful conversation. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and bring messages of courage, hope, and revelations to many more people. And when you subscribe, you also guarantee that you'll be with me every step of this journey, following the decisions, the behind-the-scenes stories, and the discoveries I'll share. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. Your words remind me that I'm not alone in sharing my story, and they create a community where every experience counts. Because ultimately, when we share our pain and learning, we create an impact and give new meaning to what we experience. And as I continued this silent battle between the fear of judgment and the need to make a decision, something began to grow inside me, a realization I could no longer ignore, a revelation that would completely change the way I viewed my own faith and my future. I spent many nights kneeling beside the bed, my face wet with tears and my hands clasped in prayer, asking God to restore what was breaking before my eyes. I believed with all my heart that if I prayed with enough faith, a miracle would happen. I prayed for transformation, for a renewal of love, for a change of mindset that would bring my husband back, not only into the home, but also into the commitment we had made at the altar. Every word I spoke was charged with hope and despair at the same time, as if the entire future depended on that plea. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and silence was the only answer I received. There were no revelations in the middle of the night, no clear signs confirming that God was working as I expected. On the contrary, it seemed that the more I cried out, the more distant everything became. The impact of this within me was devastating. I wondered if my prayers weren't enough, if there was something wrong with me, if God had decided to remain silent in the face of my pain. This emptiness brought on a crisis of faith so profound that it made me question the foundation of everything I believed. After all, what do you do when God Himself, in whom you've trusted your entire life, seems silent? It was like crossing a barren desert without a compass, without direction, without the certainty that there would be water anywhere. I kept praying, because abandoning my faith was never an option for me. But deep down, I felt my words hitting the ceiling and bouncing back, reminding me that I was alone in this battle. It was during this period that I realized how spirituality is often used as a shield to hide wounds that require concrete decisions. I prayed for Him to change the situation, but the hidden truth I didn't want to face was that perhaps the change had to begin within me. This revelation was hard, because it meant taking on responsibilities that I had tried to leave solely in God's hands. I wanted Him to resolve them, but perhaps He was waiting for me to summon the courage to act. And it was in this space of divine silence, between unanswered requests and frustrated hopes, that a new conflict began to arise in my heart, preparing the ground for a choice I never thought I would have to make. There came a time when my own prayers began to confront me. I prayed for transformation, but the silent answer seemed to push the responsibility back onto me. And it was then that the true dilemma revealed itself before my eyes: to remain in obedience to faith, or to move forward out of self-love. It was as if two opposing forces were pulling me in different directions, and I was right in the middle, being stretched until I almost broke. On one side was fidelity to everything I'd been taught since childhood, that marriage is indissoluble, that God hates divorce, that I should stand firm until victory came. On the other side was my weary, wounded heart, begging for freedom, dignity, and peace. This internal struggle became a silent journey of revelation. I began to realize that obeying faith, as I understood it, meant continuing to nullify myself, hiding my wounds, and sacrificing my identity for the sake of a marriage that no longer truly existed. But choosing self-love felt like an act of rebellion, almost a sin, because within the mindset that had shaped me, thinking of myself before others was selfish. This was the knot I couldn't undo. How to reconcile obedience to what I had been taught with the urgent need to preserve who I was? There were days when I convinced myself that the right path was to stay, and I clung to every verse about patience and forgiveness like an anchor. But there were others when the hidden truth of my situation imposed itself so strongly that I could barely breathe. The emotional impact of this wavering was devastating. Part of me believed that if I just held on a little longer, the miracle would happen. Another part screamed that waiting was only prolonging the inevitable, postponing the chance to begin again. Behind the scenes of this invisible war, I began to understand that it wasn't just about marriage, it was about identity. Who was I outside of the role of wife? Who would I be if I chose to go it alone? These questions tormented me and at the same time opened space for a new awareness. It was as if God was showing me that faith isn't about remaining in something that destroys, but about believing that He can rebuild my life even after loss. And it was at that point, amidst tears and deep reflection, that I realized that no decision would come without pain. Staying meant continuing to carry a weight that suffocated me, and breaking away meant facing judgment, criticism, and harsh stares. I was at a crossroads that required courage, and each prayerful step seemed to bring me closer to the choice that would change everything. I reached the point where there was no escape. Whatever my decision, pain was inevitable. Staying meant remaining a prisoner of a broken love, living behind the scenes in a theater that no longer made sense, maintaining a facade that consumed my soul. Breaking up meant facing the hidden truth, facing the brunt of criticism, disappointing those who believed in marriage as an unbreakable proof of faith. It was like standing before two doors that led to different paths, both filled with thorns. There was no shortcut, no easy choice, only the knowledge that I would have to pay a high price either way. I remember the day this decision materialized in an almost physical way. The dawn seemed ordinary, but inside me, everything was different. I woke with my mind weary from so much conflict, and my heart determined to no longer ignore reality. It was at that moment that I realized that living by postponing the choice was in itself a choice to remain trapped, and I could no longer allow myself to do that. The transformation I so desperately sought in my prayers would not happen without an act of courage. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee in my hands and felt the weight of years of silence and hidden tears. The decision hadn't yet been spoken aloud, but deep inside, it had already been made. I no longer wanted to live in pieces. The revelation that was thrust upon me was clear. Blindly obeying a model that was destroying me wasn't faith, it was self-destruction. Loving God couldn't mean failing to love myself. It was painful to admit this, because it meant breaking not only with my marriage, but also with the mindset that had haunted me since childhood. It meant breaking the mold I'd been given, defying expectations, risking losing everyone's approval to finally reclaim my own identity. The impact of this decision reverberated through every part of me. I knew I would face heavy stares, whispers, perhaps even rejection. But I also knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing truthfully. The day of the decision was without shouting, without explosive confrontations, only a calm firmness that emerged after so many nights of tears. It was like crossing a bridge that burned behind me as I walked, with no possibility of return. And although the fear was immense, there was also a subtle sense of relief, as if my heart finally breathed after years of suffocation. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew there was no turning back. The moment I chose to say enough wasn't marked by an outburst of anger or a scene from a movie. It was, in fact, a silent moment, but one laden with immense weight. I was sitting in the living room, staring into space, when I realized there was nothing left to save. Promises had been broken, words no longer held reality, and love had been eroded by choices that weren't mine. It was in that instant that I understood that continuing there would only prolong a pain that had already consumed almost everything within me. The decision took shape within me like a revelation, a clarity I could no longer deny. I no longer needed any more signs, because the truth had been staring me in the face for a long time. I stood up with a heavy but firm heart. When he entered the house, the silence that formed between us spoke louder than any argument. I took a deep breath, looked into his eyes, and said the seemingly impossible sentence, "I want a divorce." They were 4 simple words, but they carried the impact of years of suffering, sleepless nights, and unanswered prayers. His face wavered between surprise and denial, but I didn't waver. For the first time in a long time, I felt my voice had found its place. There were no screams, no tears in that moment, just the firmness of someone who knows they've crossed the threshold of what's bearable. That moment was the turning point in my journey. It was as if I had put an end to a chapter written in pain, even without knowing what the story would continue. The fear was still present, of course, but mixed with a new feeling, relief. I was choosing for myself, for my life, for the chance to rediscover who I was before I lost myself amidst so much silence and judgment. This decision didn't erase the faith I carried, but it showed me that faith is also the courage to rise up when everything around you tries to keep you on your knees. As he remained silent, processing my words, I already felt there was no turning back. The path was set, and I would have to face the consequences of this choice. But inside me, there was something different, a flame of hope beginning to ignite amidst the ashes. And it was in this contrast between fear and freedom that I took the first step toward a new stage in my life, little imagining how much this decision would change not only my future, but also the way I would see myself. After uttering those 4 words, "I want a divorce," a mixture of silence and emptiness washed over me. What should have brought only relief also gave way to a deep weight, hard to describe. It was the weight of abandonment, not only of my husband, but of a part of my own history. I felt as if I had failed to fulfill what I had always believed to be my mission, to keep my marriage together no matter what. This feeling of failure crushed me. Nights that followed were marked by a whirlwind of thoughts. I wondered if I had done everything in my power, if I had truly fought to the end, if I had given up too soon. The guilt came in waves, always reminding me that I was the wife who had failed to keep the promises made before God and the church. Inside me, the struggle was no longer against marriage, but against the mindset that always told me that divorce was synonymous with spiritual defeat. The fear of not being accepted by the Christian community was real. I knew many wouldn't look at the background of my pain, but only at the final decision. The impact of this would be inevitable. Whispers, judgments, looks that would pierce me as if trying to decipher the hidden truth behind what I said. It was distressing to imagine that, instead of receiving support, I might be seen as someone who had failed in faith. With each memory of the altar, with each verse about forgiveness that echoed in my mind, the feeling of inadequacy intensified. But even as I carried this weight, a small spark of revelation began to emerge. What if the true failure wasn't in choosing divorce, but in remaining in something that destroyed my identity? This question was bold, almost forbidden, but it became increasingly impossible to ignore. The transformation I so desperately sought might lie precisely in this act that seemed to contradict everything I'd learned. Still, amidst the tears and confused thoughts, the pain of abandonment was real. I wasn't just talking about losing a marriage, but about feeling like I was losing a part of myself, a part of my history, and even the place where I'd always felt like I belonged. It was a lonely process, filled with silence and internal struggles, with each step seeming to take me further away from the acceptance I'd always sought. And it was in this space of vulnerability that I began to realize that the choices I made next would be decisive not only for my future, but for rebuilding my faith and my very identity. It didn't take long for the silent stares to turn into open words. What had once been discreet whispers in the church hallways began to take shape in comments that reached me like sharp knives. Some said bluntly that I hadn't been faithful enough, that a Christian wife should have waited more, prayed more, endured more. Others insinuated that if my husband had sought another path, it was because I hadn't fulfilled my role as a woman well. Hearing these things was like carrying stones on already weary shoulders, because they not only accused me, but also invalidated all the pain I had experienced behind the scenes. I became the target of criticism that completely ignored the impact of what I had endured. Few cared about the hidden truth behind my decision. Most preferred to cling to a simple, cruel narrative. I was to blame. With each word that reached me, my mind oscillated between anger and sadness. Anger at the perceived injustice, sadness at how the community that should have welcomed me seemed more willing to point fingers than extend a hand. This open trial was perhaps one of the most painful stages of my journey. Even people close to me, who knew part of my story, chose to remain silent in the face of the accusations, as if their fear of getting involved outweighed their compassion. This lack of support further exposed the loneliness I already felt. It was as if I had been placed in an invisible courtroom, where everyone was the judge, and I had no right to a defense. The impact this had on my mindset was profound. For the first time, I began to question not only my husband's fidelity, but the fidelity of the community itself, which so values discourses on love and forgiveness. Where was the unconditional love they preached from the pulpit? Where were the outstretched hands to lift those who had fallen? These questions echoed within me like uncomfortable revelations, because they exposed the contradictions between what is preached and what is practiced. Yet, amidst this backdrop of criticism and accusations, something inside me began to shift. I realized I needed to find my voice, rebuild my identity without relying on the approval of those unfamiliar with the depths of my pain. It was at this point, amidst tears and accusatory looks, that I understood that the path to transformation would require more than the courage to break off a marriage. I would also need to break free from the stifling expectations imposed on me, and this decision would open doors to a new journey. After the divorce, the silence that had once been internal turned into an external void. Suddenly, People I believed were part of my support network began to disappear, as if my decision were contagious, something to be avoided. Longtime friends, who had previously been present in every detail of my life, now stopped answering my calls, didn't reply to messages, and when we did run into each other by chance, the conversations were cold, brief, and full of formality. It was as if the separation had changed my identity in their eyes, and I was no longer the same person worthy of closeness. Within my family, the division was painful. Some defended me, understanding the behind-the-scenes nature of my choice, acknowledging that I had endured more than any heart could bear. Others, however, looked at me with disapproval, as if I had tarnished their family, as if my decision had been the result of weakness rather than courage. These differences created silent wounds in family gatherings, where I felt at the center of an unspoken tension. It was impossible to be among them without feeling judged, even when no one said anything. In the church, the silence was even more deafening. There were no words of comfort, no visitors, not a single hug to remind me I wasn't alone. On the contrary, it felt like I had ceased to exist, as if my presence were too bothersome to be noticed. It was strange to realize that the place where I most sought solace had become the very place where indifference weighed like a sentence. The impact of this was devastating, because the loneliness wasn't just social, it was spiritual. I felt disconnected from the community, and, at times, even from God. This phase led me to reflect deeply on mindset and belonging. Can a person's worth be measured solely by maintaining an intact appearance? Is faith reduced to following rules and upholding images, ignoring the behind-the-scenes pain no one wants to see? These revelations began to open space within me for something new, though still painful: the need to rebuild my identity outside the frames that have always imprisoned me. And though solitude was a barren desert, I began to realize that it also brought a kind of clarity. It was in this silence, without applause or judgment nearby, that I began to hear my own voice. And this voice, previously muffled by so many fears, became the initial spark of a journey of transformation that I couldn't yet fully understand, but which was already about to lead me down unexpected paths. The loneliness that enveloped me after my divorce seemed, at first, like an endless desert, but little by little, this same desert began to reveal something I never would have seen if I had remained trapped under the weight of other people's expectations. In the silence of my own tears, without close friends, without the protection of family, and without the false security of the church, I began to hear a voice that came not from outside, but from within. It was as if, after so long trying to be the perfect wife, the submissive woman, the exemplary Christian, I finally had the space to ask myself, who am I, really? And it was in this painful and revealing process that I discovered that my identity lay not in the label of betrayed wife, but in something much deeper, something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. I was a beloved daughter of God. This revelation didn't come quickly nor magically. It involved entire nights of sincere prayer, no longer asking for a miracle to restore my marriage, but crying out for Him to restore me. I wanted to be whole again, without having to define myself by pain or rejection. And in the midst of these prayers, I began to realize that Christ never saw me for my failure or my difficult choices. He saw me for my essence, my purpose, the strength He Himself had placed within me. This shift in mindset was the first step toward true transformation. Behind the scenes of my journey, I began creating small rituals of reconnection with myself. Reading the Bible was no longer a religious obligation, but an intimate conversation with God. Discovering promises of unconditional love, abundant grace, and restored dignity was like receiving personal letters written to my soul. I began to understand that my worth no longer depended on maintaining a marriage or pleasing a community, but on living the truth that I was already accepted and loved exactly as I was. This awareness had a direct impact on how I looked in the mirror. Before, I saw only the scars of pain, the memories of abandonment, the labels others had placed on me. Now, little by little, I began to see a woman rebuilding herself, someone who had been hurt, yes, but it wasn't limited to scars. My encounter with myself wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. It was a journey of liberation. And the most curious thing is that, while the community was moving away, God was drawing near in a new way. He showed me that silence wasn't absence, but preparation, that solitude wasn't rejection, but a space for revelation, that every tear I had shed hadn't been in vain, but was watering the seeds of something much greater. It was at this point that I began to realize that even without understanding all the whys, I was experiencing a process of rebirth. The identity that had previously been tied to the title of wife now shifted to something much more lasting: being a daughter, being whole, being free. This discovery didn't eliminate the pain of everything that had happened, but it gave me a new perspective to navigate it. I was no longer the woman marked only by abandonment, but one who chose to rise up, who dared to believe in a future that was still possible. And it was in this intimate encounter with myself that I realized that my story didn't end with divorce. On the contrary, it was just beginning to be written truthfully, without masks, without the weight of labels, with room for a new journey of faith and hope. The process of rediscovering myself in Christ brought with it not only healing, but also hard lessons, which to this day echo in my mind as reminders of a journey that deeply marked me. Betrayal was not only a wound to the heart, but also a bitter school, the kind no one wants to attend, but which transforms the way we see life. I learned, painfully, that trust is a precious commodity and that it should not be blindly placed in those who are not truly committed to the truth. For a long time, I believed that love and promises were enough to sustain any alliance, but reality showed me that trust is built daily behind the scenes, in small gestures, in silent choices that reveal someone's character. And when that trust is broken, it's not just the relationship that crumbles, but also the internal structures that supported our identity. I had to rebuild myself almost from scratch, understanding that his mistake didn't define me, that his lack of fidelity didn't nullify my worth. This learning process was slow and painful because at many moments guilt still haunted me, trying to convince me that somehow I could have avoided it. But the hidden truth I had to face was that each person is responsible for their own choices, and it wasn't my place to carry the weight of decisions that weren't mine. Forgiveness was another inevitable lesson, not the superficial kind of forgiveness that repeats cliches, but the profound kind of forgiveness that requires letting go of the desire for revenge and releasing the chains of resentment. At first, I thought it was impossible. How could I forgive someone who destroyed my trust, who exposed me to judgment, who tore up sacred promises? But I understood that forgiving wasn't justifying, much less forgetting. It was freeing myself. It was releasing the poison that consumed me inside and choosing to walk lightly even after carrying so much weight. Forgiving was a conscious decision, repeated every day, until, little by little, the wound began to heal. And perhaps the greatest revelation of all was about resilience. Betrayal knocked me down, but it didn't destroy me. At first, I only saw ruins. Today, I can see that it was precisely these ruins that made room for something new to emerge. I discovered that resilience isn't about denying pain, but about moving through it with courage, even when all seems lost. It's about looking at one's own fragility and finding hidden strength within it, a capacity to rise more consciously, stronger, more human. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a journey full of falls and new beginnings. But it was through this process that I understood that pain, however cruel, can also be a teacher. I learned that trust must be cultivated, that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, and that resilience is the power to start over, even when life insists on pushing us down. And looking back, I realized that these lessons, though they cost tears and endless nights, are now part of the foundation that sustains me and guides me for the next steps of my journey. Rebuilding my faith was perhaps the most delicate and at the same time most powerful part of this journey. After the betrayal, the divorce, and all the trials, I found myself facing a God who seemed silent, distant, almost inaccessible. For a long time, I associated faith with obligation, with the need to follow rules and maintain a perfect image to be accepted. And when everything fell apart, this model of spirituality crumbled with it. It was as if I needed to relearn how to approach him, but now in a more honest way, without fear, without masks, without the burden of appearing strong when, in fact, I was in pieces. At first my prayers were short, almost whispers of someone who no longer had the strength for long speeches. I simply said, "Lord, I am here." And gradually, I realized that was enough. God wasn't expecting rehearsed words, but sincerity. This revelation completely changed the way I related to him. I began to understand that faith is not a stage for performances, but an intimate place of encounter, where I can be vulnerable and still be deeply loved. I began seeking new ways to connect, ways beyond the routine I'd followed almost mechanically. Sometimes I simply walked alone, observing nature and letting every detail remind me of God's care. The rising sun, the gentle wind, even the birdsong seemed to tell me I wasn't forgotten. Other times, I wrote letters to him, putting my fears, my revelations, my doubts, and even my anger on paper. This exercise in sincerity was like opening a window and letting light shine in again, and something profound began to happen. I realized that God had never turned away. It was I who hid behind the masks I'd created to be accepted. When I let go of the struggle to appear perfect, I found a God who had always been there, willing to walk with me through pain and rebuilding. This impact was transformative because it shifted my mindset. It was no longer about obeying out of fear, but about living a faith that freed me, that gave me the courage to be who I truly was. Behind the scenes of this process, I learned that true spirituality doesn't erase pain, but walks through it with us. It was this awareness that gave me the strength to revisit the Bible with fresh eyes, not as a rule book, but as a love letter that reminded me daily that I wasn't defined by divorce, betrayal, or judgment. I was defined by grace. This rebuilding of faith didn't make me immune to criticism or painful memories, but it gave me something much greater, peace. A peace that didn't depend on the church's acceptance, my family's approval, or the restoration of my marriage. A peace born of the certainty that God saw me exactly as I was and still called me his daughter. And it was in this new understanding, free from the shackles of fear and masks, that I found the foundation to move forward with hope, believing that my journey still held chapters I would never have the courage to write alone. If I could look into the eyes of every woman who today carries within her the pain of betrayal, the weight of abandonment, or the suffocating silence of faith worn as a mask, I would say, I know exactly how you feel. I know what it's like to wake up every day with a heavy heart, trying to smile at the world while inside it feels like everything is in ruins. I know what it's like to carry a secret that screams inside you, but that needs to be silenced so as not to disappoint others. I know what it's like to kneel on the floor and beg for a miracle that never arrives the way we expect, and what it's like to believe that maybe you're the one who isn't enough. But the truth is, you are not to blame for what they chose to do to you. Betrayal is not a reflection of your worth. Abandonment is not proof of your weakness, and God's silence does not mean he has stopped loving you. These are lies that fear and judgment try to plant in your mind, but they need to be uprooted. You are much more than the label of a betrayed wife, a rejected woman, a Christian who couldn't keep her house standing. Your identity is rooted in something much deeper, something no one can steal. You are a beloved daughter of God, regardless of what happened. I know that the backstage of your life may be filled with tears no one sees, but it is in this space of vulnerability that you will find revelations that can transform your mindset. Don't let the heavy gazes or the cutting words of your community make you believe you have to live imprisoned. Faith wasn't meant to suffocate you, but to free you. God isn't a cruel judge waiting to point out your error. He is a father, a comfort, a refuge. And even if people turn their backs on you, he remains there, sustaining your steps when you think you no longer have the strength to walk. I want you to understand something that changed my life. The decision you need to make isn't between faith and self-love, because loving yourself is also an act of faith. It's believing that God wants you to live in fullness, not in emotional chains. Breaking away doesn't mean spiritual failure. It could be the very door to the transformation you've prayed for. And if you decide to stay, let it not be out of fear of judgment, but out of conviction and clarity, knowing that your choice isn't born of pressure, but of truth. There's no easy answer to the pain you feel. Every tear you shed has an impact. Every decision you postpone weighs heavily. Every step you take demands courage. But you're not alone on this journey. There are many women, like me, who have walked through the same dark valley and found at the end new hope. And I can assure you, your story doesn't end where the betrayal began. There are more pages to be written, pages filled with strength, new beginnings, and a faith that is no longer built on fear, but on the revelation that you are loved exactly as you are. If today you feel voiceless, remember, your story matters. If today you believe there's no way out, remember, there's always a way, even if it's still obscured. If today you feel like you no longer have the strength, remember, resilience isn't about never falling, but about getting back up again and again, even with scars. You may be in the midst of the storm now, but it won't always be this way. The journey that begins in pain can transform into a powerful testimony of healing and liberation. And that's why, even after everything I've been through, I speak with conviction. Don't give up on yourself. Don't hand over your identity to those who don't know how to value it. Don't allow faith to be used as a prison when it was created to be a path to freedom. And above all, don't believe the lie that your story is over. Because even amidst the ruins, there's always something new being prepared. And this truth can become the fuel for the next steps you're yet to take, steps that no one can erase. The power to start over wasn't born on a sunny day or a magic word that erased all the pain. It was built, little by little, with each simple decision not to give up. At first, it meant getting out of bed even when everything inside me was begging me to stay in bed. It meant looking in the mirror and seeing more than just a wounded woman. It meant relearning how to take care of myself, how to allow myself to smile, how to believe that my life hadn't stopped at the point where someone chose to betray me. It was a silent process, but full of revelations, because it showed me that starting over isn't about denying the past, but giving it new meaning. Restoring my self-esteem was like rebuilding a house after a fire. Every compliment I learned to give myself was a new brick. Every boundary I set was a wall built. Every decision not to accept less than I deserved was a roof over my head. I began to understand that loving myself wasn't selfish. It was obedience to God who made me with such care. This mindset changed the way I viewed myself, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to show my true self. Dreaming again seemed impossible, but the dreams began to blossom again. At first, timidly, almost hidden, like seeds sown in the soil. Then, stronger, like trees growing from the cracks in the concrete. I discovered that I could desire new things without feeling guilty, that I could believe in future plans without the weight of the past. This transformation was liberating because it showed me that my life didn't end in a page of pain, but was open to chapters of hope. With every step, God reminded me that He hadn't left me alone. On the contrary, it was in this desert that He taught me to walk without crutches, to trust the process, to believe that my identity lay in Him and not in circumstances. It was in this emptiness that He gave me new colors, new meanings, new beginnings. Today, I know that my faith didn't die with my marriage. On the contrary, it was in this desert that God showed me who I truly am. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear yours too. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with other women who need this message, and let's create a space for healing and support together.